Hello and welcome back to another tier list video. Today we are going to rank the H2 leaders and wonders. I'm very excited to do it. However, before we are going to start, I first want to say thank you because in the last days I reached the 1000 subscriber mark on YouTube on my channel. And yeah, that is a very big milestone for me. I'm very happy about it. I'm very happy that doing those videos, which I enjoy doing, yeah, that those videos are well received and that there are some people out there who enjoy the videos and can maybe sometimes learn something from them or just watch them to see some 3DH's gameplay. I'm definitely very happy. And for those who are on the 3DH's Discord, those already might know it, but since almost a month, I think already, there's a little bit of a project in the making that I will then upload in as a video as a 1000 subscriber special. So you can definitely look forward to a very special video that I hope will be very exciting for you. Alright, but now without further ado, let's start with ranking those H2 leaders and wonders. First of all, it has to be said that now even more, of course, how strong those leaders and wonders are completely depends on the board state that you are having when you enter H2. And so I definitely, the ranking will be biased maybe on my tendencies, on how I like to play the early stages of the game. And if you maybe have a different play style, maybe find yourself often in different situations than I am, then this list is maybe not that useful for you. However, I will maybe try to talk about why I think that certain leaders are maybe a bit better, or maybe often better than others, and why maybe some are a little bit more difficult to use. So I hope there are still some useful information for you at the end. Alright, and now let's start with taking a look at Johann Sebastian Bach, one of the big culture leaders. A leader that definitely is in S tier for two-player games, because they are being able to build a lot of culture production is extremely important, and Bach is often grabbed for 3 civil actions, especially if he is maybe one of the or the only culture leader or one of a few, and if there's maybe no Shakespeare in the game. But the question is, how strong is he in 3 and 4-player game? Because those games are a bit more economy focused, and just going for a bit of culture production is maybe not that ideal. But nonetheless, I do think, and again, this list is for 3-player games, I will put Bach in A tier. Because I think also in 3 and also in 4-player games, maybe in 4-player games I would consider putting him in B tier, but maybe I would also just let him stay in A tier, because I do think it's just such an easy way to get some culture production going. You get 2 culture production just by default, and then if you have opera or drama, you can maybe just build one, you already have 3 culture production, you get a little bit of a science discount, and then you can maybe upgrade a temple, maybe upgrade a lab if you have maybe built 3 of them earlier or have some science production elsewhere, and then you very cheaply can get some culture production. And if the game stays relatively peaceful, you can just build more and more operas, get a lot of culture production, and that can then be quite strong. And in 3-player game, it definitely happens from time to time that the game is a bit more peaceful and that it is possible to run a little bit away with the culture while also managing to defend yourself. And Bach is just a leader that has a lot of potential, can produce a lot of culture, and the setup that you need for him is just not that difficult to achieve compared to maybe, for example, a leader like Shakespeare, who also has tons of potential and maybe a higher ceiling than Bach, more potential, but just needs a bit more of a difficult setup. But because the setup for Bach is so easy to achieve, I think he's also just a very, very viable leader. In 3 and 4-player games, you just have to be careful that you do not overextend. Still, just make sure that you have a nice economy, that you have everything covered, that you don't fall behind in the military. But then you can just maybe very cheaply sneak in a little bit of culture production and run away with the culture, while still being able to defend yourself and have a decent economy, and that I think is still very strong. Then we have Catherine. And Catherine is just a very solid leader, doesn't require a very special setup. She just always will give you 2 culture production, 1 military action, and then at some point you maybe have the ability to potentially steal a yellow token from 1 or even multiple opponents. And yeah, that is definitely solid. But she doesn't really have a very high ceiling. the ideal situation, or where she is maybe the strongest. It's the question if that is an ideal situation. But if you're on a republic, because you maybe had a chance to get into it early, but you miss out on strategy and other military action solutions, then I think getting Catherine, getting the third military action can be extremely strong, and then that is maybe where she is the strongest, because then the difference between being on 2 and 3 military actions is just very big. But I think compared to some other H2 leaders, the ceiling from her is just not that high. She's just most of the times very solid. Sometimes you don't need a military action that much. Only 2 culture production is not that much compared to what other leaders can potentially produce, especially if the game progresses. Then I think other leaders just have a bit more potential. And so at the end, I will put Catherine in C tier. She's most of the time very fine, and also stealing the yellow token can of course be quite nice. You have to use the politics action. That can sometimes be annoying, because if you are one of the stronger players, it also can just be very useful to maybe see it, play an aggression, play a war, and then having to not do this in order to steal the yellow token can sometimes be a bit bad, but nonetheless it is powerful to maybe get an additional yellow. No, but nonetheless, I do think some other H2 leaders have just more potential, and so at the end, I will put Catherine in C tier, but especially if you need a military action, she can just be a very useful leader and can give you some nice benefits. Then the next leader that we are having is James Cook, who is maybe a little bit difficult to rate. Maybe I will put him, or maybe I will rate him a little bit unfairly. He just feels a little bit like the buy like a small additional package that you get when you maybe prepare for the Suez Canal anyway, because I think if the Suez Canal is not in the game, it often is maybe the question if it is really worth it to invest heavily into a colonization strategy. It can still be strong. Winning colonies has a lot of use cases, just from what you get from the colonies alone. So that can definitely be nice. But especially if there's the Suez Canal as a payoff, that I think is the time when colonization strategies can really shine. So if the Suez Canal is in the game, then I often try to go for colonies. And then, of course, James Cook can be quite nice together with the Suez Canal. But just for him to get a bit of cultural production, I think it's not that strong to just because of him set up for a colonization game. And if you don't have the Suez Canal, you sometimes can be fine. Sometimes you just end up having maybe 2 colonies or something, then he gives you 3 culture production. Also, of course, the ability to help you during colonization should not be forgotten. I think not that long ago, I had a game on my channel, I think from the Intermezzo Championship, where I knew that some colonies were coming, and I very early went for James Cook, just because of the ability to help me winning those. That can, of course, be very viable. And if you have an extremely big Suez Canal, maybe with 5 colonies or something, then of course Cook is very strong, but then you oftentimes have that strong of a position anyway that maybe, yeah. But of course he is then still very strong. At the end, I actually made the decision to put him in D tier. Maybe it is a bit harsh. He definitely has a lot of potential. But no, I just no, thought that he on its own is sometimes just not really that strong. Maybe it's a bit unfair to put him in D tier, but I also didn't find any other leader that I wanted to put in D tier, and so at the end it will be James Cook, who sadly has to fill up the space in D tier, but it's very hard to rate him, and so it could be a bit unfair. Then we have Darwin. And Darwin I find a bit tricky to rate, because Darwin has a lot of potential. Sometimes you are maybe in 2 labs, then there's a copy of journalism, you have some additional population, you build 2 journalisms, and out of the sudden Darwin is a leader who produces your 4 culture per turn, and also adds some additional civil actions along the way, and that is of course a very, very strong package. The problem is that it definitely will happen relatively often that you maybe from the early game have the free religion. And then if you want to go for him, you lose one happy phase. And just because of Darwin, I'm often not willing to maybe actively try to go in an arena setup. If there's also Pierre in the game, I more often will, but then the arenas also tend to be a bit more contested. And yeah, if I have this one religion, then of course Darwin is a bit annoying. Oftentimes I think it's good to try to have just exactly as many happy faces as you need to, so losing the one from the religion is quite bad. If you have no religion, then of course he can be very fine, but often it will also be that you maybe in 3 and 4 player games don't have the freedom to just put even additional workers into labs or maybe journalisms or libraries, so you will maybe get 2 or 3 culture production out of him, will sometimes save some civil actions. That's definitely quite fine, but as you not that rarely will have the religion lying around, I do think that maybe makes him a bit weaker. So for him, it was a very close call for me if I should put him at the lower end of B tier or the higher end of C tier. From my general feeling about him and the potential that he can have, I felt like I should maybe put him in lower B tier, but on the other hand, I just for my gameplay, do not that often find the ability to get into a strong Darwin for some reason. Only in 2 player games, I think I often go for Darwin. In 2 player games, I would maybe put him in A tier, just because he is also a leader that can produce you a lot of culture and can sometimes be extremely strong. I had 2 player games where I even had 6 culture production from him with 3 labs and 3 journalisms or something like this. And then he can be extremely strong. For 3 player games, it's a very tough call. I think I will end up putting him in the higher C tier. Maybe if I in the next months will find some nice opportunities to make him work again, my opinion will already change again, and I will put him in D tier, in B tier, in D tier hopefully not. But for now, I will put him in higher C tier because I think more often than not you will have the free religion, and then I'm oftentimes not sure if it is worth it to get this downside of losing a happy face just to get his abilities going. But he definitely has a very high ceiling, has a lot of potential, and if you manage to make him work more often, he can definitely also be in B tier or maybe even A tier. The next leader that we are having is Anthony Gaudi, who of course is the profile picture of this channel here, meaning that maybe am supposed to just put him in S tier, but yeah, of course I will not rate him according to this. However, I do think that Anthony Gaudi is a relatively useful leader. A leader that can allow you, if the game stays a bit more peaceful, to just get a bunch of culture production going, and I think getting 4 different urban building types is oftentimes at least doable, or definitely 3. Sometimes you definitely have some labs, then you maybe had a free religion, and then you can maybe get Anthony Gaudi and either get into journalisms, operas, or maybe if you have no other happy face solution, into some arenas, and you already produced you 3 culture, saves you some science. You have always the ability to get more culture out of him, get even more science saved, and also sometimes I think it happens you have maybe then had Anthony Gaudi, maybe build an opera or journalism with him, and in an H3 there are computers, then you can develop the computers, again with a 2 science discount, maybe even sometimes an even bigger discount, and so he definitely can save you some science along the way, produces you some culture. You of course need to have a little bit of setup, but as I said, oftentimes you have the free religion, oftentimes you definitely have some labs, and then at some point you maybe want to invest into some other urban buildings anyway. So I do think it's not that rarely that Anthony Gaudi can be put to at least some decent use, and then has just also a big upside, similar to Bach. Not that easy as Bach. You can just spam a lot of operas with Bach, but having a big variety can also be then nice for some impacts. And so I will put Anthony Gaudi in B tier. Because I also think he has a bunch of potential, and I do think it's not that difficult to get some very decent value out of him. Yeah, maybe it's a bit high to put him a complete tier above a leader like Darwin or Catherine. Maybe Darwin should belong in B tier. Maybe I should put Anthony Gaudi in C tier, but my general feeling is that maybe it is at the end fine to have him 1 tier higher. Now we are getting to Maria Theresa, and Maria Theresa in 3-player games I think is just extremely strong, because it is very, very easy to, at the beginning of your turn, be at least weaker than one other player. It will often, very, very often, just happen naturally, because the other players will, of course, try to overtake you in strength. Maybe there are some strength events, and then you can sometimes just easily get 3 resources per turn out of her. and then also some additional science and culture. Of course, you need a little bit of setup, but I do think the setup that you need for her is maybe something that you need anyway, because in most of the three-player games, you first of all need a way to get more population. If you don't get any new population, you're in a bad spot anyway, so that's something that you want to achieve anyway. And then building some military is very, very useful most of the times as well. So I do think while you need a bit of setup to make her work, and maybe it's also you need to get a little bit experienced and in how you can best use her resources every time. But if you maybe have a little bit of experience with her, maybe you just use her to go for some upgrades from warriors to riflemen, then you get some new population, can start building some other units, then she very quickly, maybe after having had her 5 or 6 turns, can have produced you something like 15, 18 resources, maybe 5 science and culture, and that is an amount of value that is just extremely high for an H2 leader, or generally for a leader, and is just extremely useful. And so for 3-player games, I do think Maria Theresa is an S tier leader. It's just you can just get so much value out of her, and you need some setup, but I do think you need some setup that you maybe need anyway. So I do think you always have to consider her, even if you don't have any food production yet, you probably want to get some food production going at some point. You can only take her in hand, maybe elect her as soon as you get some food production, or you already elect her, and maybe can do a set some upgrades to riflemen, already use her 3 resources per turn, which is already very strong, and then and then later on get some science and culture in addition. For 4-player games, it's not that easy to get 3 resources out of her every turn. Of course, also in 3-player games, sometimes it will happen to only get 1 resource, but I think often you can very nicely get 3 resources out of her very often. And then even if you are have not that much resource production, you can still build a lot of military. So if you are aiming to build up towards a big war at the end of H3, Maria Theresa can be such a nice leader to have, and the benefits that you can get out of her can really make the difference on how much strength you can achieve and how much the opponents can achieve. And so with that, that's just extremely powerful. In 4-player games, as said, it's a bit more difficult to get as many resources, so maybe I would put her 1 tier down. For 2-player games, the military resources are often not that much needed. It's just extremely important to go for culture leaders, so also Anthony Gaudi, I think, is definitely an A tier for 2-player games. Then Maria Theresa definitely drops a bit down to maybe B tier, because she definitely still has also some potential in 2-player games. But yeah, in 3-player games, I think she is the king, or the queen. All right. Next up, we have a leader that can be a complete game changer in certain situations. The question is, how many times will you be in such a situation? And that is just something that heavily depends on your playing style, I think. I do think some players, or some very strong players, are fine with having not the most science production, enter H2 with not having not the most science, and then I just think Robespierre can be such a strong leader to get. If you get him and get Republic, and you have maybe only 4 science saved up, and it would take quite a while until you can develop a government peacefully, then you can just get into Robespierre, get a government form, and then you save a bunch of science, but you get into a situation that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get into. And with having out of the sudden 7 civil and maybe 3 military actions, the military action from Robespierre is of course also extremely useful, because ideally he is paired with the Republic, because it's very cheap to do a Republic revolution. And then if you are in Republic, the additional military action is very useful to have. For me personally, I think I just am not that often in situations where Robespierre is useful. I do think I am a little bit more often in an H1 government form than other players, in which case Robespierre can sometimes still be nice, maybe getting him late in H2 and hoping to get a revolution going in H3 or something like this. But then, of course, Robespierre is not really a leader that you are looking to get into. And if I don't have an H1 government form, I often try to build up some science production. I personally don't like it to play on low science, and so I then often will be in a situation where I can just go for an H2 government peacefully, in which case the other leaders maybe offer some bigger benefits. Of course, if you have a nice opportunity, you can of course also just do a Robespierre revolution. If you would have the option to maybe go for the Republic peacefully, it's still 9 science saved. A leader like Nobel or Newton needs some time to produce you that amount of science, but still at some point those leaders will have maybe produced more value. Nobel also gives 2 strength, Newton will save you some further civil actions. So with the setup that I'm aiming towards, I just think I am not that often in a situation where Robespierre can be strong, and he is actually also the H2 leader that I had picked the least in the last World Championship. Because of that, I will put him in C tier. However, if your playing style is a bit different, he can definitely be a B tier or A tier leader, because he can be a complete game changer if you manage to just get into Republic in a situation where you normally never would be able to easily get into it, and then out of the sudden play the next turns already in 7 civil action, while otherwise you would have maybe been stuck on 4 civil actions. So if you are more often in a low science game, Robespierre can be just extremely strong. Of course, Robespierre is also a nice transitional leader. Maybe if you get him late, you can at one point save a lot of science and then hope to get maybe an H3 leader going relatively early. And that is of course also a nice use case out of him. But if you are in a low science situation, definitely do not hesitate to also use him early just to get those many civil actions going. So no, a leader with a lot of potential, a leader that can be a game changer, but that I'm personally I'm not that often in a situation where he is very viable. The next leader that we are having is Napoleon. And I do think Napoleon can be very threatening. You can easily get 4 strength out of him if you just have something like a phalanx or medieval army setup. If you get him early in H2, those 4 strength can really make a big difference, easily make you the strongest, put you maybe in a range where you can even pull off an aggression if you are maybe one of the strongest already anyway. You can really put some pressure on the others, force them to react maybe in an awkward manner. Maybe they have to destroy some stuff just to not be in danger of aggressions and wars, and that is just potentially very powerful. So it again depends on your playstyle. Do you really want to go for a bit of a military push? And then I think it can be very viable. Of course, it's also possible to use Napoleon in a defensive manner, make it that you are not in danger of an aggression if you're maybe in relatively low strength, and then maybe you can play a bit more greedy with having the additional strength from Napoleon. That's also a way how you can play him. And I will end up putting him in B tier. If you go for a military plan more often, he definitely can be higher. But I do think the additional strength can just be very useful. Later on in H2 or maybe H3, there's the potential that he will give you 6 or even 8 strength. That's a very big amount. A military action can be useful. So, he can be very threatening. He potentially can be used to make yourself safe and maybe just go for a bit more of a greedy economical setup. But compared to a leader like Maria Theresa, who just gives tons of value, and thanks to the additional value will allow myself to have more strength and have strength that is actually permanent, because after she will have left my board, I still have all the military that I have built up thanks to her. I think compared to her, Napoleon is just maybe not that strong, but of course getting the strength instantly, and especially if you get him early, can be quite strong. But you also have to get something out of it. So if you just take the strength for the sake of having some strength, and then out of the sudden you don't get any aggression off, the opponents maybe don't have to change their playstyle not that heavily, then of course he isn't really doing that much for you. But I think he definitely deserves to be in B tier. Next up, we have a leader who I think, similar to Maria Theresa, can just produce you a lot of value, and you have again you need some setup for him, but maybe a setup that is also again generally very nice to have anyway, because I do think getting into H3 with a lot of science production leads to just having a strong economy, and then you have Newton have even more science, save some civil actions. I do think that is a nice position to aim towards. and then Newton gives you maybe 2, potentially if you are entering H3 at some point even 3 science production if you get computers or multimedia, and saving some civil actions. I do think you often have the position where you are on H3, have Newton as your leader, maybe you already picked one of the H3 leaders, maybe one that is even quite useful, someone like Einstein, but you just then you play your turns, and the civil action always proves to be more useful than switching to Einstein already. I do think that showcases how nice it is to have Newton, and that you often want to just keep him also in H3 for quite a while, just because he is producing such a big amount of value, can really lead to big economies with having big science production. With Newton, you can maybe afford to get into an early oil a lot easier, also thanks to him saving a civil action when you will develop the oil. If you get early computers, your science production will just completely explode. So if you have a setup with either journalism or scientific method, or maybe have a chance to make that work, he can be very, very strong. With alchemies or printing presses, he's not that strong, but sometimes can still be a fine pickup, because saving some civil actions, getting a little bit of science can at least still be fine, and there's always the potential that you then can in H3 maybe upgrade those buildings to computers or multimedia, and out of the sudden make him to a very strong leader. But ideally, of course, you want to pair him with scientific method or journalisms, and I do think it's not that difficult to set up for him, and then he just produces you a lot of value. Because of that, I will put him in A tier in front of Bach, but 1 tier lower behind Maria Theresa, at least for 3-player games, because their Maria Theresa is just so extremely strong. In 4-player games, I don't think he is a tier below Maria Theresa. The next leader that we are having is Nobel. And I do think when the expansion came out, for quite some time, a lot of people valued Nobel very, very highly, just getting 2 science production and 2 strength without requiring any setup. I do think Nobel in some tier lists was definitely an S tier or something like this. And I also, of course, valued him quite highly. Nowadays, I, of course, still think he is a very fine leader, but I don't value him that highly. And I will end up putting him in the higher end of B tier. Of course, him not needing any setup is definitely an advantage, and what he gives you is definitely solid. I do think it's especially solid or very strong if you get him early H2. I do think getting the additional 2 science boost and the 2 strength makes a very big difference there, and you not that rarely see players maybe grab him even for 3 civil actions at the beginning of H2. And I do think that can often be justified. So at the beginning of H2, he is maybe A tier or S tier. But I do think the more the game goes on, the more mediocre his benefits are. I mean, compare him to a leader like Newton, who gives you maybe the same amount of science, but saves you civil actions. Of course, you don't get the strength, but I do think the civil action saved is just a higher value. Maria Theresa will probably produce you less science, but tons of resources, a bit of culture along the way. Bach has a lot of potential. And then when we enter H3, I do think that is the point where Nobel potentially can become problematic, because leaders like Bach and Gaudi can just start produce a lot of cultures, the opportunity is there, and then such a leader like Gaudi is, I think, just more pleasant to have potentially. Of course, also in H3, the additional science and strength can still be useful, but if you maybe compare it to Marie Curie, if you have a scientific method and cool setup, Nobel is just a very weaker version, because you get those benefits that Marie Curie would give you without a cultural production. I do think with the coal and scientific method setup, Marie Curie can be a very fine leader if you get her especially early in H3, but having that without even the 2 cultural production is just very mediocre, and I do think the longer the game goes on, you just don't get that much out of Nobel any longer. And then we have to, of course, mention one downside that can be easily overlooked, but I do think it is actually quite problematic, and that is that he doesn't give the civil action back when he will be replaced. In H3, you often have to do a lot of stuff, and I do think losing 1 civil action when replacing Nobel is actually very annoying. I do think it is not happening that rarely that you take a lead and you actually would like to elect him immediately, but you have that much stuff to do that you just have to keep him in hand for another turn, because you can't elect him without getting the civil action back. And I do think that actually makes him quite a bit weaker and problematic. So in contrast to Newton, who will save you a lot of civil actions along the way, he at some point will cost you a civil action. And now, nonetheless, he doesn't need any setup. He, especially if you get him early in H2, can be very strong. So I will still put him in B tier, but definitely not higher. And now, but of course, also the Nobel Prizes can potentially be strong. Of course, it's something that all players can potentially profit from, but the science from Nobel, of course, helps you to maybe have some science saved up, and you can maybe also take him in a position where you have already some science production, and then you are the best prepared for those Nobel Prizes. Then he can maybe score you even some culture after he's gone, especially if you're aiming into a very science-heavy setup. So with that, I definitely think he has some potential also, maybe makes up for him not producing any culture with having the ability to maybe score more Nobel Prizes than your opponents. But now with the civil action cost, I think he can be quite problematic, and just the two strength and two science will, when you enter H3, start to feel more and more mediocre if you then compare it to what the other leaders that your opponents will be having are maybe offering to them. The next leader that we're having is James Watt. And I do think that 3-player games, 3-player is the player count where James Watt shines the most. In 2-player games, you have 2 copies of iron, only 1 copy of coal. I do think James Watt is a D-tier leader in 2-player games, because oftentimes you just want to get into the iron setup. You don't know it all when this 1 copy of coal is coming. It needs to come together with James Watt, because if you first take James Watt, 2-player game is a player count where high drafting is very viable. The coal can just be high drafted. So in 2-player games, I think it's very rarely possible to use James Watt nicely. If you get in the right position and can just take him in coal, he can of course still produce you a lot of value, but I do think it just happens too rarely. In 4-player games, we have 3 copies of iron, so only 1 out of 4 players will miss out on the iron. But in 3-player games, we have 3 players, but only 2 copies of iron. So I think that will happen the most, that you will enter H2 without an iron setup. Of course, sometimes you maybe have the chance to go for iron, but just don't go for it because there are more important priorities. But I do think more often than not, all of the copies of iron will be put to some use. But in 3-player games, it will happen the most often that you are maybe playing without iron, and then there are 2 copies of coal. It's just likely that you will at some point get one of those copies. In 4-player games, there are also only 2 copies of coal, so there yeah, of course, if you are the only player without iron, it's maybe also perfectly fine. But maybe it's happening a bit more often that actually one of the other players either skip the iron completely or maybe only kept it in hand, had some other priorities and can take the coal away. So no, it will, I think, happen the most often. And if you get the coal together with James Watt and maybe also haven't upgraded your farms yet, he definitely can produce you a lot of value and is extremely strong. But of course he needs a very specific setup, but as in 3-player games the setup that you need for him is maybe achieved the most often. I at the end will put him in B tier, maybe just behind Nobel. Because if you get him going, he can produce you some extremely big amount of value. If you go for coal and selective breeding and for 2 farm and 3 mine upgrades, he will save you 4 science and save you also 10 resources. But not only that, thanks to him, you get the upgrades going quicker. And that's maybe something that you would normally like to do anyway, but only because of James Watt you can do it. So you get the production going early, and that adds up on the discount that you're already getting out of him. And then he at least gives you a bit of culture when he leaves the game. If you have the railroad, it can actually be a somewhat significant amount of culture. If you maybe have coal or potentially even oil. And also in 3-player games, there are 2 copies of oil, 2 copies of mechanized agriculture. It's not that unlikely that you maybe have a shot at getting one of those. Sometimes James Watt can be very fine. Maybe if you go just for him for selective breeding, maybe rather late in H2, he can also be a very fine transitional leader because you have the ability to get all of his discounts going in a very few amount of turns, and then you can switch to another leader. But if you have iron and maybe you only go from selective breeding, there's always the big potential that maybe you have a chance to get an early oil and your position will extremely explode during H3. and so I think it's fine to put James Watt in B tier. If he works, he is extremely strong, gives you an amount of value that definitely doesn't have to hide itself from leaders like Maria or Newton, or maybe it's even gives probably even more value maybe, but it's a bit more difficult to have the right setup for him as for those leaders, I would say. Then we have only one leader left, and that leader is Shakespeare, who also has a very, very high ceiling. You potentially can save a lot of science, a lot of resources, get a happy face, get tons of cultural production along the way. And same as Bach, Shakespeare is definitely S tier in two-player games. If he's in the game, you really have to make sure to have printing presses, at least maybe in hand, because there's only one copy of journalism, and then you are able to set up for him if there isn't an early military pressure going on from maybe your opponent or maybe yourself. And then he can just produce an extremely big amount of cultures in 3 and 4 player again, where maybe is a bit more military pressures going on because there are more opponents, more likely that one of them will push military. Some strength events will maybe be there. And you generally want to avoid being the weakest, then it's of course somewhat difficult to go for a setup. Maybe it's also again a bit on what is your playing style. I at the end made a decision to put Shakespeare for 3-player games into C tier. Maybe he deserves to be higher up because if you are prepared for him, he still offers you a very big amount of value. And if you have done a Shakespeare setup in H3, you at some point want to have a leader that produces you some culture, and then Shakespeare can just be so extremely strong. But still, having that amount of free population, having libraries and theaters, I do think is somewhat difficult to achieve. It's definitely not impossible if you maybe watch some of Sandwhale's video, which are definitely highly recommended. Then you maybe notice that he actually also in 3 and 4 player games tries to maybe set up for Shakespeare more often than I do, and it's definitely possible if you make sure to have a high amount of population income and can maybe go for those buildings without leaving yourself too vulnerable. So it's definitely fair if you have a bit of a different playstyle, put them a bit higher. I find it often a bit difficult to set up for them in 3 and 4 player games, but it definitely can be worth it to try setting you up in this way, because then he can just give you tons of value. Maybe I should do it more often, maybe he then would deserve to be a bit higher up, but I do think it can be quite tricky to set him up, because in high level games there will also often just be a lot of military pressure, a lot of military build up. Players will very efficiently build their economies, and then if you set up for Shakespeare but end up just being too vulnerable, of course, then also nothing good is done for you. But also the happy face is of course quite useful. I said about how annoying it is when you have Darwin and lose one happy face if you have a religion. Then of course getting one additional one is also quite fine, but taking him just for the happy face is of course maybe sometimes something that you not really want to do. Now we have all of the leaders ranked, so let's get those wonders going. And we start with the Harvard College, or maybe an improved version of the Universitas. And you know that I rated Universitas an S tier in my H1 tier list. The Harvard College, of course, comes a little bit later, but I still think science production is extremely useful, and yeah, it's just very powerful. I will not put it in S tier, however. I do think there are wonders that producing even more insane amounts of values, and if you are getting it very late, maybe the science production will be a bit late, but even if you finish it late, I do think it can be very fine. I will put it in A tier. Yeah, of course, the ideal setup is if you have maybe some early iron production, get the Harvard College maybe early, and with that very easily fix your science, and then have a very pleasant game ahead of you. The ability that you can play a yellow card on the same turn is of course, doesn't play the most important part of it, but also shouldn't be seen as a completely irrelevant, nice gimmick, because being able to play it sometimes can lead to quicker upgrades, can then again snowball into maybe some other benefits. In H3, if you have a lot of civil actions, especially, you can maybe just because of the Harvard College threaten more strength, your opponents have to count it in. Can you maybe take and play a patriotism? Can you take and play a military build-up when they have to think about whether to declare war against you? Sometimes you can maybe go for a surprise war because of getting a patriotism and being able to play it immediately with the Harvard College. So it's definitely an ability that should not be underestimated. Sometimes you have the Harvard College and you never manage to make nice use out of it, but I do think it often there is the opportunity to maybe get a yellow card going immediately and actually also get something out of it. Of course, you don't have to do it just to use the wonder if the situation doesn't require it. And no, so also I think a relatively cheap wonder, but only 3 steps, 11 resources. When you compare to the costs of the other wonders, I do think that's a relatively cheap price, and I do think getting the 3 science production is just very useful. Next we have the Eiffel Tower, and that is a wonder that I personally don't go that often into, but a wonder that definitely you should consider if the situation is right. I often don't find the time myself in 3 and 4 player games to invest a lot of resources and civil actions into mainly just culture production. So Eiffel Tower and Louvre are generally not the wonders that I often try to build, especially because I think those other H2 wonders just offer so extremely strong benefits. But the happy face from the Eiffel Tower can make building it very, very worthwhile. If you find yourself in a situation where you think that the happy face is either immediately useful or will be useful very soon, maybe if you lose the 2 yellow tokens at the end of H2, I do think the Eiffel Tower can be a very nice wonder, can free up a worker, can maybe give you that 1 happy face without requiring to invest any science if you are not that high on science at this point. And then, of course, the 4 culture production will produce you some culture, will be nice to have during H3. So definitely there are situations where the Eiffel Tower can be quite powerful, but overall I don't go that often for it. I do think the other wonders just offer some maybe even stronger benefits, so I will at the end put it in C tier, but there are definitely situations where the Eiffel Tower can be very strong to build, and so I definitely doesn't deserve to be in D tier. Maybe I would rather put it even in B tier than D tier, but I think I just go for it too rarely, and maybe it doesn't fit my playstyle as nicely as I try to build up a very strong economy most of the times, but especially if you use the happy face, it's a very, very solid wonder to build. Next up we have the Kremlin, who I do think gives some very strong benefits. A civil action, a military action, 2 culture reduction, I think would normally be a package that is just extremely useful, very strong. Having even more civil actions is very nice in H3. Sometimes you are on low military action, it really makes a difference whether you have the 1 additional military action, but even if you have some more military action, it can still be useful to maybe at some point draw some more cards in H3 and maybe have an easier chance to go for a war, something like this. The thing that I think holds the Kremlin a little bit down is actually the unhappy phase. So for Darwin I already said it, for the Eiffel Tower I just said it, the happy phase can be quite useful, and the Kremlin gives you an unhappy phase. And as said, oftentimes it can be very nice to aim towards a position where you have just the amount of happy phases that you need. And in such situations that I often find myself in, if you finish the Kremlin, you immediately have to see how you can maybe get some more happy phase. Sometimes it's relatively easily doable, but maybe it's still a little bit of an easy investment. But because of that, I just don't that often find the ability to go for the Kremlin. However, if you find yourself in a position where you at the moment have some surplus happy phases anyway, maybe you got a free religion, have the Forbidden City built, and at the moment just you are not using the Forbidden City to its full account, then in such situations where you actually have some surplus happy phases, the Gremlin can give you very, very fine benefits, is a strong wonder to build, but the unhappy phase oftentimes prevents me from going for it, and it will also land in C tier, maybe above the Eiffel Tower. I even considered putting it behind it, but just because getting an additional civil and military action and some cultural production is a very nice package. I will put it before the Eiffel Tower, but I will put it in C tier. Maybe if you find yourself more often in situations with more happy phases, if you're, for example, a fan of St. Peter's Basilica or something, then the Kremlin definitely can be B's, maybe even A tier. But for me, the unhappy phase just often prevents me from going for it. Then we have the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty offers you 3 additional yellow tokens. and also some culture production. Often you will maybe go for it when you have an H2 government form, then you get 2 culture production. Sometimes you even have the chance to get into an H3 government form relatively early in H3, then it even produces you 3 culture production. And I do think the Statue of Liberty is just a very, very solid wonder. I will put it in B tier. I do think the additional yellow tokens are very nice to have. If you manage to build it, it always feels very pleasant getting those influx of 3 yellow tokens into your yellow bank. It just makes playing the game more pleasant. But I also find it often that in H2 you're just trying to fix every area of your economy that you haven't covered yet. And sometimes I just don't find the freedom to invest into the statue, as the 3 yellow tokens alone don't help you to cover one of those things. For example, the Harvard College, you build it and your science production is normally covered. The ocean liner service, you build it and your population income is basically covered. And the statue you build, the yellow tokens will be useful, but it doesn't completely cover one of the needs that you maybe want to fix. So sometimes it feels like a very nice bonus on top of what you are doing, and if you are able to get that bonus extremely strong, but sometimes you just don't find maybe the freedom to invest 12 resources into it. But I do think the yellow tokens are very nice. I think going into H3 it's very important to have a nice flow of new workers coming in, not having to disband anything if you have to react to a military push. It's just extremely strong to have a lot of population, and the 3 additional yellow tokens definitely help you with that, and you also get a bit of additional culture production going. So I do think the Statue of Liberty is very worthwhile to build if you find a chance, and it doesn't prevent you from maybe fixing very urgent needs that your civilization has. So at the end it will be in B tier for me. Then next, we have a wonder where you maybe know that I'm really not the biggest fan of it. Maybe the wonder that I rate the lowest from all wonders in the game, potentially. But nonetheless, there will still be situations where it is nice to build. Again, a nice showcase of how awesome this game is and how well balanced it is. I do think in other games, if you maybe have to name the card that you potentially find the worst card in the game, it will just be a card that never will be used and through the ages, regardless of what you consider the worst card to be. I'm not sure if I consider the Louvre the worst leader or wonder card from all leaders and wonders, but it definitely would be among the candidates, I would say. But still, the Louvre will be worthwhile to build in some situations. Maybe a chain, if your playing style is a bit different, you will build it more often. But for me, it definitely goes into D tier, and yeah, because you build it and you just get some culture production, and that even at the cost of losing some blue tokens, which if you don't have any additional blue tokens, really make it challenging to get out of corruption. You maybe will even lose more resources along the way. If you have additional blue tokens, I think it's more worthwhile to build, but even then makes it again harder to get out of corruption. You maybe can't easily save up that many resources any longer, so you just build it for pure culture production, which I think in 3-player and 4-player games is an investment that is just very expensive doing at a time when you maybe have the chance to go for the Louvre. I think there will be so many important things to do, and then just investing 13 resources into pure culture production is something that I find myself very rarely doing, especially because building this then also out of the SAT makes it more challenging to get out of corruption and makes you less flexible. It's of course nice that you have the ability to at some point get some resources back. You of course ideally don't want to do it early because then you're just sacrificing some culture reduction very early. But having those 6 additional resources lying around can be nice. So you're on H3 and the other players always have to consider I want to go for a war against him, but actually he could just take 6 additional resources out of the Louvre if he really has to. So that at least helps you protect maybe the culture lead that you are getting if you maybe go for the Louvre. Maybe I'm underestimating this, but still you lose 3 blue tokens as long as you have all of those lying on the Louvre. And yeah, I just don't like it that much, and I very, very rarely go for it, but there are definitely situations where it will be the right move to go for it. Then we have the next wonder, which is one of the wonders that when I did my last interview after winning the World Championship, I think was one of the few things where I said maybe that needs to be nerfed or fixed, because it is, I think, just a too strong wonder, the Ocean Liner service. It will, of course, go into S tier. It only costs 10 resources, so from the resource cost, it's even the cheapest one that at least costs 4 civil actions, which makes it maybe a bit more costly than something like the Statue of Liberty. But you get an additional yellow token, and you just get one population out every turn. You build the ocean liner, and you know that you will play the game with plenty of population. Having plenty of population is very strong. You can build this, and you don't have to require any science investment. So you enter H2, get the ocean liner, you don't need to invest science into it, meaning you still can quickly save up some science to maybe get into an H2 government form, and then that will just be insanely strong. Also, what should not be underestimated, you get the worker out completely free. If you go for selective breeding upgrades, you maybe also can manage to get a bunch of workers out, maybe especially if you combine it with something like Statue of Liberty in the yellow tokens. But the problem is, you have to pay a civil action to increase your population all the time. The Ocean Liner service just gives you that for free. So basically, this Ocean Liner service also just gives you a civil action. And you can be fine just with the Ocean Liner service, and you have your population income covered. Ideally, you most of the times want to still go for a farm upgrade at some point, but it's definitely not urgently needed. Ideally, you even have the irrigation, then you have a very cheap way to avoid any famine issues. But even if you don't have any irrigation or selective breeding, building some additional farms can still be somewhat fine, but of course then some of the population that you maybe would ideally want to use somewhere else have to put into farms. So I think more often than not, especially if you have the necessary science, you maybe want to go into selective breeding, or ideally you have a copy of irrigation lying around in your hand, or maybe already put into the game in play, and then that is a very nice way to fix any famine incomes. And of course, the Ocean Liner service pairs very nicely with Maria Theresa, so that is a very strong combination that you can look towards getting if you are playing especially a 3-player game, but also in other player counts. And so before the expansion, the Ocean Liner service cost 2 resources more, those steps in the middle cost 2 instead of only 1 resource, and it didn't have the yellow token. Then it got buffed. I'm not sure if the buff was even needed. I didn't really play it without the expansion. I don't know how it was back then. But I could consider that the Ocean Liner service would also still be strong if it costs 12 resources and doesn't give a yellow token. It definitely would be a bit weaker. But then it got buffed with the yellow token and the resource reduction cost, and I think at least one of those buffs was maybe too much. So I think one of those buffs maybe could be taken back, and it would still be a very, very strong wonder. Now it just feels like it is maybe a bit too strong, because I personally, the Ocean Liner service is one of the things that I look the most into. When I do my videos and do the overview over the leaders and wonders, I most of the times talk about almost all of them and some synergies, but when I just want to get a quick overview on what might be important in this game, then Ocean Liner service and one of the other wonders that we are still will be seeing to be discussed. One of the 2 main things that I'm looking towards, because with the Ocean Liner service, I value it a lot more highly to have an iron setup, because that makes it a lot easier to build this, fix your population without science income, so being a bit lower on science can be fine. Because you can have a chance to fix your population income if that is in the row early. Very often you will see it taken for just from the 3 civil action area if the players have the opportunity to do so, and I specifically set my civilization up in a way that I have the chance to take it, because that is just so strong, getting that. But even if you get it later, you will still get maybe 5 population or something, or maybe 6 population if you build it at the end of H2 or at the beginning of H3. That will still be every additional population is helpful, so also late, I think it still offers some very nice benefits. The next wonder that we are having is the Transcontinental Railroad, which I think is quite a strong wonder to build. And I sometimes read some strategy discussions or questions about the railroad where players said you invest 12 resources into it, but it doesn't even pay off until the end of the game. And that is maybe true. Sometimes the resources that you invest into it will not pay off until the end of the game. But the thing that those players are overlooking, I think, is that the 5 strength is actually extremely useful. Either can easily put you ahead in strength, so you're investing something, your strength is very nicely fixed, and you will also be playing with more resource production for the rest of the game, and while maybe you don't get a pure amount of resources out of it, I do think having more resource production during Age 3 is just very helpful. You can more easily switch between strategies, you can build up similar tree, but then you realize you don't really have the payoff cards for it. You can still switch into cultural production or the other way around. You start building some cultural production, but because of your strong resource income, you can still you can still switch into military and maybe have enough resource to build up towards this, which already with iron, I do think the railroad is a very fine wonder. Also nice to build it early because the 5 strength makes a very big difference at this point of the game, and then you're just playing with 8 resource production most of the times, which is very pleasant to do. But of course with coal it potentially gets even stronger sometimes, then it's not easy to build it early, it will be finished a bit later, so I don't think that it is that much stronger with coal than with iron. But of course, if you build it with coal and go only for 2 coal upgrades, you're already on 10 resource production, which is very strong. If you also have enough science income and population income to put those resources to good use, I do think you have a very strong H3 ahead of you, and the 5 strength also are just very, very useful, so I think it's a wonder that definitely deserves to go into A tier. I might even consider putting it before the Harvard College. I think I will end up putting it behind it, but it's very close between those, I would say, and I might also be fine if I just put it before the Harvard College. And if you go for the railroad with the iron setup, there's similar to James Watt, if you maybe take him with iron and use him for selective breeding upgrades, there's always the chance that you get an early oil in H3 and then your production will just completely explode. You go for 1 oil upgrade with that 1 mine, you have 10 resource production, maybe you have 2 other iron mines, so with only 1 upgrade you will be at 14 resource production. You don't necessarily have to do any more upgrades, you can even maybe at some point delete those other mines, and if you don't have the most population. Of course, you need fine science income to not miss the science that you invest into oil, because having a lot of resource production isn't useful if you can't put those resources to good use. But it is just fine if you build it with iron, also already strong, and you have that big potential that your position can just explode at the beginning of H3 if you are set up in a way that you can afford an early oil and then just go into it with the railroad. So another nice benefit of this wonder. Then we have the next wonder, and that wonder is the Suez Canal. 1 resource production per colony that you're having. Even if you build it, you can get 1 colony from your hand into play for free. And that wonder is maybe the one that I'm actually looking the most towards when I opening the Leaders and Wonders overview, and I immediately look, is there the Suez Canal in the game? Because that really determines, I think, how strong is a colonization strategy. Of course, it also depends on how much additional setup is there. Is there maybe Cook? Is there Maria Theresa? Is there in H2 Isabella, Barbarossa, maybe Eleanor? Are there some leaders or Columbus that help you setting up towards the Suez Canal even more? But I do think the Suez Canal is the main piece that you're looking towards if you consider if you want to go for a colonization game or not. And the Suez Canal has just a huge potential. If you have 2 or 3 colonies, then you get a colony for free, and you have 3 or 4 additional resource production, and sometimes of course you go completely crazy and have 6 or 7 resource production that you get out of this wonder, and you get a colony for free, and that is just completely insane. And just because of that, you oftentimes try to maybe set up and go for a colonization strategy, invest into cartography, maybe go for Colossus, and just try to go into that setup where the Suez Canal out of the sudden just lets your position explode. The thing is, even putting the colony in play alone sometimes can be worth it enough, especially if you have a strong colony. For example, consider getting the autonomous territory with the Suez Canal. Even if you have no other colony, it sometimes can be worthwhile. You're basically getting a civil and military action similar to the Gremlin. You don't get the unhappy phase, but you lose 2 blue tokens from the autonomous territory, so that both can be an annoying downside, so maybe relatively equal. The Gremlin gives 2 culture production, but you get 1 resource production from the Suez Canal, and you get the 1-time bonus from the autonomous territory. So just with the autonomous territory, I do think the Suez Canal can already be compared to something like Gremlin. Just with inhabited or vast territory, the Suez Canal can already be compared to something like Statue of Liberty. But if you have more colonies and actually getting 3, 4, even more resource production out of it, it is just extremely strong. You really want to have a colony in hand. Building it just for the resource production is not that strong. If you have a lot of colonies, sometimes maybe it can be considered, but it is the free colony that also is a really big part of why the Suez Canal is actually that strong, because those H2 colonies offer some very, very nice benefits. And getting one of them for free is just extremely strong already on its own. And then if you have already some colonies, of course, you're getting some very big resource production. So even though the Suez Canal needs some setup, I will also put it, not in C tier, in S tier. Behind the ocean liner, because the ocean liner doesn't require basically any setup. I mean, if you have your food production already covered otherwise, maybe it's not the most urgent thing you need to invest into, but even then it can be fine. The Suez Canal needs some setup. You need to have a colony in hand, ideally already some colonies in play. But just with it being present in the game, I often aim towards being in a setup where this is the case, just because it is that strong to have it. So maybe if you say because it needs setup, it only should be in A tier, maybe it's fine, but I will still just put it in S tier, just because it has the possibility to give you an insane amount of value and basically win you the game on its own. And yeah, so with that, we have also the last wonder ranked. I do think ranking those wonders was relatively easy for me. Of course, a lot of you might still have different opinions on all of them, but for me it was relatively clear why I want to put those wonders. For the leaders, I found it a lot more difficult. Should Darwin be in C or in B tier? Does maybe Shakespeare have to go up? Robespierre, because he can just be such a game changer. Catherine, Gaudi. It's just very difficult to really compare those leaders. At the end, I have put them, like you can see it here, but I don't have a strong opinion on their placement, and yeah. But I do think I'm somewhat fine on how the list is looking now. Maybe putting James Cook in D tier is a bit too harsh. Yeah. But with that, we have done the tier list for H2. But again, remember, it heavily depends on your setup, and if you're going for a different setup than I am more often, then your evaluation may be completely different. If you are playing a lot with your friends and you have established maybe a specific meta, a game, also the tier list can completely change. But from my experiences that I have with playing a lot of high-level tournament games, I am now at the end somewhat fine with the evaluation of those leaders and wonders. Alright, with that we are at the end of the video. Now we have only one more age ahead of us, and after that, maybe the first World Championship games will already be finished, so you can be looking forward to those, and you also can be looking forward to my 1000 subscriber special, because if you don't know yet what it will be, definitely I think will be something very exciting. Alright, with that I say thanks for watching. Of course, let me know in the comments what you think of my placement and where you have different opinions. And yeah, then have a nice time and see you in the next video.